Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Joshua. Yes, ma'am. We are in Joshua chapter 11, starting in verse 16. Joshua chapter 11, and starting in verse 16, where we pick up in the story of Joshua. There's sort of a summary of his conquest that then leads into sort of the dividing of the land. And when you kind of look at the overall picture that's painted here, there's really a parallel between Joshua in the Old Testament and Jesus in the New Testament, and sort of the path that was paved to help us to conquer over sin, as the people there kind of a parallel of our own struggles. You know, they had the idol worshiping and they led the people astray, and that's what our sins do, they lead us astray. And so starting in Joshua chapter 11 and verse 16, it says, "Thus Joshua took all of this land. He took the mountain country, the south, all the land of Goshen, the lowland, and the Jordan plain, and the mountain of Israel and its lowland." And it goes on to describe places that he took. In verse 18, it says, "Joshua made war a long time with all of those kings." And through chapter 12, it's really going to emphasize that Joshua was concerned with the kings. And so they certainly took cities and they destroyed cities, but Joshua kind of paved the way by, as the leader of the people, he takes out the leader of their enemies. He kind of cuts off the head of their problems. But the people themselves still had kind of the work to do of removing some of the rest of what remained there. And so when he picks up in chapter 12, he kind of reviews in those verse 6 verses what Moses had done. And then in verse 7, he focuses on those kings. He says, "These are the kings of the country which Joshua and the children of Israel conquered on this side of the Jordan." And then if you notice, starting in verse 9, he begins to name them. There's the king of Jericho, one king. The king of Ai, which is beside Bethel, one king. The king of, and I think this is really important for later in these chapters, but notice verse 10, he says, "the king of Jerusalem, one king." And he goes on and he describes all of these different places, and emphasizing Joshua got rid of the head. He got rid of the king that was over those countries. That's the hardest part, right? If you get rid of the king, the people have no leader, it's a lot easier to move forward from there. And when you think about that as a parallel, you know, Hebrews chapter 2 says Jesus came to destroy sin and destroy death. And in what Jesus did here, he gave us a path forward, sort of paved the way, because he conquered sin. He conquered sin by not giving in to temptation. And he conquered sin by becoming our high priest, so that we have a place to turn to in time of temptation, and a priest who knows what it's like to be tempted, to help us find that way of escape that 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 13 describes. And so you have, just like Moses had prepared the way, the Old Testament has prepared the way for us. And then just as Jesus prepared the way, Joshua has prepared the way, or just as Joshua prepared the way for them, Jesus has prepared the way for us. But notice Joshua focused on the kings. He got rid of kind of the head of it all. But there was still the work that needed to be done. Notice chapter 13 and verse 1. Joshua was old, advanced in years, and the Lord said to him, "You are old." When God tells you you're old, you can't argue with that, right? That's just unarguable. But you are old, advanced in years, and there remains very much land yet to be possessed. This is the land that yet remains, all the territory of the Philistines, and all that of the Geshurites, from Sagor, which is east of Egypt, as far as the border of Ekron northward, which is counted as Canaanite, and the 5 lords that are described in verse 3. And verse 4, from the south, all the land of the Canaanites, and Meara that belongs to the Sidonians, as far as Aphek, to the border of the Amorites, the land of the Gebalites, and all Lebanon toward the sunrise, and so forth and so on. And into verse 6, he describes who these people are. He says in verse 7, "Now therefore divide this land as an inheritance to the 9 tribes and the half-tribe of Manasseh." And so Joshua got rid of the kings, but what were the people still needing to do? They still hadn't taken all of the land. They still hadn't taken the cities of the land. And I think that is a parallel. You know, Jesus has paved the way for us to conquer sin. But that doesn't just mean that we just automatically, conquer it. We still have to reach out and accept that victory. We still have to do our labor in overcoming the temptations and the things that are before us. But chapter 13 emphasizes that the reason why we are so willing to do that work is because there is an inheritance that is promised and assured. And we can trust that that inheritance is there if we will just do the work. In verse 8, he says, he describes the other half, or the half tribe of the Reubenites, with the other half tribe, the Reubenites and the Gadites received their inheritance, which Moses has given them. And he picks up then, explains some about that, and says in verse 13, nevertheless, the children of Israel did not drive out the Geshurites or the Maacathites, but the Geshurites and the I'm just making that up, the Maacathites dwell among the Israelites until this day. And verse 14, only to the tribe of Levi had he given no inheritance, the sacrifices of the Lord God of Israel made by fire are their inheritance, as he said to them. And he goes on in verse 15, he describes the land that Reuben had. These are the people on the other side of the Jordan that Moses conquered. In verse 24, he describes the land that Gad had. And in verse 29, he describes what the half tribe of Manasseh had. And then in verse 33, he comes back to the Levites and he says again, but to the tribe of Levi, Moses had given no inheritance. And this is really a neat thought, isn't it? The Lord God of Israel was their inheritance. And you think, in what way was God the Levites' inheritance? Yeah, so they're the priests. Yeah, and what do the priests have access to that nobody else does? Yeah, they are the closest ones to God. They get to be there in the tabernacle, later in the temple, just as close to God as humanly possible at this time period in history. And so he says, the honor and the closeness of being, there working for God right there in his very presence, that was better than receiving a territory of land with which to live in. And so he says, the Lord God of Israel was their inheritance, as he said to them. And so we as Christians today still have conquering to do in our own lives. There are still perhaps mountains of giants that tempt us, sins and difficulties for us to overcome. And but he says, oh man, this is just not working tonight. This is my mountain, this microphone right here. He says, our inheritance is assured. And we can look and we can see Christians around us who have received perhaps a greater portion of that inheritance than we have already. You think about Hebrews 11, it describes all those who came before us. And in chapter 12, he says, these are a cloud of witnesses. Kind of the idea of they're in the stadiums cheering us on, saying, we did it. And if we did it, you can do it too. And we can look around at those who have been in the faith longer than us, and we can see what they haven't attained all of it, Philippians 3 says, but how they've attained in faith and wisdom, and how they've grown, how they're benefiting from the inheritance of God. And we can say, if they're doing it, then I can do it also. And especially I think we can remember what 1 Peter says, 1 Peter chapter 2 and verses 3 through 5, when he says, we are the priesthood today. If you are a member of God's people, you are a priest, just like those Levites. And so therefore, you have the honor and the blessing of God being your very inheritance, that you have the blessing of being as close to God as any person on earth today can be. And so, these pictures of inheritance in Joshua are not just pictures of what things are like in heaven. He is describing a picture of what things are like here for the Christian, that we, in a way, are receiving much of the blessings and the promises and the inheritance that God has offered us. The greatest portion, of course, is in heaven, and that we look forward to, but we are not without great blessings here as well. And that was true for the Levites, and that's true for us as well. And so, chapters 11 through 13, he's really emphasizing God promised victory. And he promised that he would go before us and prepare the way. And he did that. The question just becomes, am I going to follow that path fully and therefore receive all the inheritance that he offers, or am I not going to? And that's really what he starts emphasizing in chapter 14. But before we go to chapter 14, any thoughts or comments so far?
Did they have to conquer any more battles with people to get the rest of it?
Sure, yes, they did have to, and they should have done more than they did. But there, yes, even toward the end here of Joshua's life, the people are still fighting some of those battles, and especially if we were going to study all the way to the book of Judges, we'd see that the tribe of Dan was fighting those battles pretty late, perhaps even after Joshua had died. Yes, ma'am. Any other thoughts or comments on these chapters that we looked at so far tonight?
I'm just going to say the Levites were, they lived in the towns.
Yes.
And they weren't given some pasture lands for their livestock. Nothing to live on, no land to live on.
Right, yes. Yeah, they, in essence, they were kind of donated some towns and pasture land to have, but they didn't have if you were from Judah, you had a home base where all the people of your tribe were from. And the Levites were kind of flung out across and constantly on the move. They were always, in portion having to come back to Jerusalem to serve in the temple and then go back home. And so it was, there was kind of an extra layer of work involved, but he's saying it's well worth it. So, yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. That's a good question. So Manasseh was one of the largest tribes, and back in the book of Numbers, back in the book of Numeronomy, that's not a thing. Numbers, when Moses was coming up, so here's the Jordan River, if you can kind of picture it in your mind. Canaan is here, but they conquered a bunch of people that lived on the other side of the Jordan River, and at that time, two tribes, Reuben and Gad, and then half of the tribe of Manasseh asked if they could just live on that side of the river. And Moses said, as long as you'll fight for your brethren, you can do that. But the other half of that tribe said they wanted to live in, promised land proper. And so when time came to divvy all the land up, half of them already had their property here, and the other half found their home on the other side of the Jordan River. Does that answer your question?
It says, for the children of Joseph were two tribes, Manasseh and Ephraim, and they gave no part to the Levites.
Yes, and so Joseph had two sons, and this goes all the way back to Genesis. You remember, of his two sons, Joseph's father Jacob blessed both of them. And remember, he flip-flopped it. He put his hand on the youngest son first. Joseph tried to switch it back, and he said, no, this is what we're doing. And so he blessed the younger son to be the more blessed of the two. But both of his sons suddenly almost became like two separate tribes in a way, because it was Joseph's receiving really the double blessing of the oldest son is what he was receiving. And so they're counted as Ephraim and Manasseh. But because half of Manasseh lived on one side and the other half lived on the other, Manasseh started being called, the half Manasseh and the half Manasseh. So
is that when he gave up his birthright for a bowl of soup?
That would actually be his Jacob's brother, and not Jacob's grandson. And so Jacob's brother Esau gave up. Yes, that's right. But it's sort of a similar thing that it goes to the youngest son instead of the oldest, but for different circumstances. Yes, ma'am. All right. Anything else? Yes.
What I found interesting was, there was half a tribe on the east side and half a tribe of Manasseh on the west side, but the land mass on the east side was much bigger than the land mass on the west side.
Okay.
There was a lot more land, but probably equal.
Yeah.
People.
Well, and that's, some of those tribes have a very small space to work with, and some of them had a kind of a more broad space, but some of that, of course, had to do with some of those places were densely forested areas, or, you lived kind of up on a mountain, and so it might look like a lot of space, but it's less space that you could build a house on. On the east side, they have quite a bit of land, but then it hit desert. And so you go far enough and there's really not a lot of habitable land because that's where the Arabian desert is. People did live there, but they were more nomadic in nature. So, yes, ma'am. All right, picking up then in chapter 14, if there's nothing else. Chapters 14 through 19 focus on showing us how the 12 tribes divided up the land. And I'm sure that in the back of your Bible or in something along the way, you've probably seen a map, and it kind of has the different maybe colors or some kind of border to show you that each tribe, except for Levi, had their own little space of land that belonged to them and to them alone. And it's kind of remarkable if you've ever known some families when they have a relative pass on, and it comes to like reading a will or what have you. There's a lot of arguments and fighting about who gets what, but these people really, for the most part, they don't do that. They really are kind of working together. There's kind of a sense of unity here.
That's why you always have to have a clear deed.
A clear deed is a helpful thing, yes, and God in essence kind of gives them that. And so in chapter 14, this is really kind of the heart of this section and my favorite part, because it's the story of Caleb. And Caleb is just a really fantastic and encouraging account of a man who, remember, he's 85 years old at this point. And so when he was 40, he spied out the land and said, let's take it. But the people said no. And so for 40 years, Caleb had to also wander around. Even though he wanted to go in, he had to wander around the wilderness and wait for that generation to die off. He and Joshua are, in essence, the only people of that generation still alive. And when he was 80, he was finally able to go in the land. They've been fighting battles for 5 years. And so for 45 years, Caleb has been waiting for this moment. And it finally comes to the point when they say, well, Caleb, God promised you that you get to pick your spot. What spot do you want? And so he looks at all of the land and says, well, there's this mountain over there with all of these big giants on top of it. That looks good to me. And I don't think that's probably what I would have been looking at. I'm looking for some low spot that's already empty or something. But he wants the spot with all the giants on it. And so he goes and he climbs up that mountain. You think giants are already tall? Yes, ma'am?
At 85?
At 85 years old. Of course, it does say that the Lord had sort of preserved his strength in really a miraculous kind of way, that he had strength that most 85-year-old men don't have. But even still, he's 85 years old, and a giant is already taller than you, so that gives them an advantage. You put them up in a fort above you. Anyone who has the high ground has the advantage, and you surround him with a bunch of his friends, right? So you have a whole bunch of these giants in a fort above you. They have the obvious physical advantage, but it's nothing for Caleb, because he said, God said I would win, so I know that I will. And the phrase that's used over and over again for Caleb is found in verse 8, also verse 14, and in many other places. I think it's 6 times it says this about Caleb in the Bible. Verse 8, it says, nevertheless, my brethren who went up with me made the heart of the people melt, but I wholly followed the Lord my God. In Numbers, it's that God himself says, Caleb is different. He has a different spirit in him than other people because he has wholly followed the Lord his God. And so, what really the idea is, he had devotion to God, devoted, he was dedicated to God, but he says holy, the idea of a complete and overflowing devotion. If this is the cup, a lot of people are devoted to God, but their cups are half empty. They're kind of devoted to God. They're kind of devoted to something else. Caleb's was not just full of devotions, it was spilling everywhere. It was overflowing devotion to God. And so he goes to the top of the mountain, Hebron, and he conquers it. In chapter 15, it begins to describe the land around Caleb's mountain. And the land around Caleb's mountain is big. And it includes Jerusalem. And so what you're shown here is there's all this potential for Judah to have all of this land, just like Caleb did. Caleb had all the land he wanted because he had overflowing devotion. All the rest of this land is available for that same level of faith and conquering. And just to emphasize how much they could have, he begins in verse 13 to give a second account about Caleb, where Caleb is thinking about his daughter. And he says, I have this daughter that I love, and it's time for her to get married. And what I want more than anything is for her to marry a man who has a faith like mine, a faith that goes up on mountains and conquer. If I'm going to give my daughter to anyone, it's someone who can conquer a mountain of giants because he trusts God so much, right? That's what he's looking for. And so he says that. He says, whoever can do this. And verse 17, there's a man named Othniel, and that's what he does. He goes up and he conquers a second mountain, just like Caleb did. And so he gets to marry Axa, which, they have this deep, like, kind of guttural thing. And I always imagine her name sounds a lot like Hakanapaloogie or something, but I'm sure she was a lovely girl. But, he gets to marry her. And then there's this very curious story part of it, starting in verse 18. It says, now it was so when she came to him that she persuaded him to ask her father for a field. And so she dismounted from her donkey, and Caleb said to her, what do you wish? And she answered, give me a blessing. Since you have given me land in the south, give me also springs of water. And so he gave her the upper springs and the lower springs. And there's a lot of debate about what this means exactly. Like, what did he leave her waterless and she was, dying of thirst? Or did he give her way too much and people had to go to her for water? The point of this is those mountains were known for having they were full of water. There was tons of water on those mountains. And that's the point. People didn't give their daughters inheritances usually. You got an inheritance through your husband. But Caleb his overflowing devotion led to overflowing blessings. He had so much blessing that when his daughter, who normally a man couldn't afford to give an inheritance, asked for a blessing, he didn't just give her upper springs, he gave her lower springs. Overflowing blessings come when we trust God enough to be overflowing in our devotion to him. And so he is an example of how it's done right. And remember, it started chapter 15 describing the land of Judah. All that potential, that was 2 mountains. It could have been all of that land was that way. But what we begin to see starting in verse 20 is the people in general don't have that kind of devotion. And so it describes the cities that they did have, but notice in verse 63. In verse 63, it says, of chapter 15, in verse 63, it says, as for the Jebusites, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, that's the capital someday, David's capital city of all the land. It says the children of Judah could not drive them out, but the Jebusites dwell with the children of Judah at Jerusalem to this day, to the moment that Joshua wrote this down. Now remember, back in chapter 12 and verse 10, what had Joshua already done for the people? The king was dead. He had killed the king of Jerusalem. At that moment, it would have been easy for them to go into the city and to completely conquer it the way that they did Jericho and eventually Ai and all of those other cities along the way. Joshua had done the hard work for them, just as Jesus has paved the way and done the heavy lifting for us today. But they didn't drive them out. Caleb is an example of how it can be done. Jerusalem was on top of a mountain, a very difficult city to attack, but so was Hebron and the mountain that Othniel attacked, and it was accomplished completely. But they didn't do the same thing for Jerusalem, and would not do that for generations, hundreds of years, until David finally does it a long time after this. And so you get this contrast here. Overflowing devotion, overflowing blessings. Partial devotion, partial blessings in this life. Why do we often not have the full measure of the peace that surpasses understanding? Why do we often not have the full measure of that lack of anxiety that Paul tells us about? Why do we not have all of the great blessings that God says belong to us by victory through the blood of Jesus Christ? Very likely it's because we are only partially devoted to God, because we have not given him everything in our life and are not following him to the fullest extent that his word shows us. Now, we're not talking about perfection, of course. Caleb wasn't perfect either, but he was devoted fully and always willing to go anywhere God told him to, always willing to cut off anything that God told him to conquer whatever sin God put in front of him. And the other people weren't, and so they really missed out. You remember what happened to them later, because they didn't get rid of the people in the land. That's what the book of Judges is about. They suffered so much because I'm sorry.
They became snares of the
That's right. That's right. They became snares. That's since Sarah brought that up, let's go ahead and look at Judges chapter 2 and verse 1. Judges chapter 2. And we'll actually look at verse 2. Judges chapter 2 and verse 2. It says, "You shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of the land. You shall tear down their altars, but you have not obeyed my voice. Why have you done this? Therefore I also said, I will not drive them out from before you, but they shall be thorns in your side, and their God shall be a snare to you." And the people wept when they heard this. And kind of the point of that is the influence of sin. They didn't get rid of it as fully as they should have. And so it kept stabbing them in the side. It kept pulling them away from God. And the book of Judges is just how over and over again they would kind of get it all back together. And then sin would creep back in because they didn't get rid of it. And it would pull them back away from God, and they would suffer greatly because of it. That's the difference between Caleb and the rest of the people. He picks up then in chapter 16. Chapters in 16 and 17 shows us how much this kind of partial devotion leads to loss. Chapter 16 is about the land of Ephraim. That's one of Joseph's sons. He had two, and they had Ephraim and Manasseh. Ephraim received a portion of land. But notice in verse 10, just like the people of Judah, they did not drive out the Canaanites who dwelt in Gezer, but the Canaanites dwell among the Ephraimites to this day, and they have become forced laborers. So you read that and you kind of think, well, that doesn't sound so bad, does it? Right? Like, they have people who have to work for them and lift things up for them and do things for them. They kind of have a ready-made labor force. The same thing happens to the other half of Manasseh. That's what chapter 17 is about. And notice verse 13. In chapter 17 and verse 13 it says, "And it happened, when the children of Israel grew strong, that they put the Canaanites to forced labor and did not utterly drive them out." And so they're thinking to themselves, God said destroy them completely, but if we just keep a few of them around, right? We've got someone to go take the gross things out of town so we don't have to. We've got someone to work in our fields. We've got someone to, rub our feet at night and make life easier for us. That doesn't sound so bad, does it? But it's deceptive, because what ultimately happens to these people? Who are the ones who are oppressing them and persecuting them when we get to the book of Judges? The Canaanites, these same people. Sin will try to show you and make you feel like if you just keep a little bit of it around, just this, that's going to work in your favor. That's going to be better for you. It never works that way. What is that phrase? I was asking Sarah the other day, I can never remember, about how sin always takes you further than you wanted to go and keeps you longer than you wanted. Thank you. Yes. Sin always takes you further than you wanted to go and keeps you longer than you wanted to stay. It tricks you into thinking, this is just going to be okay. I can handle it. I can quit whenever I want. I can manage this. You can't. That's what 1 Corinthians 12:12, he says, take heed lest you think you stand. You will fall if you think that you can handle that temptation. You've got to have that way of escape. The way of escape for them, cut it off completely. They couldn't handle the temptation, and that's borne out by history. And we see it leads all the way to the destruction of Jerusalem 2 times. The destruction of Jerusalem, because they couldn't handle that temptation. And so partial devotion leads to compromise that seems better, but it is not better. Notice then in verse 14, it says that the children of Joseph spoke to Joshua, right? And so this is their complaint. Why have you given us only one lot and one share to inherit, right? They're the tribe of Joseph, but broken into 2. Since we are a great people, and as much as the Lord has blessed us until now. And so Joshua says, if you are a great people, if you're as mighty and strong and big as you say that you are, then go up to the forest country, that's the place they already had, and clear a place for yourself there in the land of the Perizzites and the giants, since the mountains of Ephraim, are too confined for you. And so they continue verse 16, the mountain country is not enough for us. That's what Joshua just said, right? It's too confined for you. Here's what you do. You own all this forest land where the giants live. Go clear the forest and get rid of the giants like God told you to, and suddenly you've got a lot more land to work with, don't you? And they say, well, I mean, that's not going to work for us. They say, all the Canaanites, verse 16, all the Canaanites who dwell in the land of the valley have chariots of iron, both those of this place and of that place. And so, verse 17, Joshua said to them, what did you tell me? You are a great people, right? You're just so big and strong and awesome, right? And so, you're a great people. You have great power. But the thing is, they really were a great people, weren't they? They really did have a great power, didn't they? What was that power? It's the same power that had conquered Jericho, the same power that had conquered Egypt, the same power that had been leading them through all these battles all this time. They had seen these things. He says, you are a great people and you have a great power. And so you don't have to have just the one lot. The mountain country is yours. Although it's wooded, cut it down to the farthest extent that it goes, it's yours. And you shall drive out the Canaanites through, though they have iron chariots and are strong. Does God care if a nation has iron chariots or not? Is God limited by how powerful the enemy's tools are? No, of course not. Satan has very powerful tools. God is not limited by those things. And so they just want to take somebody else's land that's already conquered and have a little bit easy. And Moses says, clear the clutter and follow the commandments all the way through. And you'll have everything that you need. You'll have all the space that is required. Partial devotion leads to partial faith. Partial faith leads to greed and to laziness, to excuse making, and to not having the full measure of blessings that God says are yours. You can have them. It just requires us to obey to the fullest extent that God shows us. All right. Before we pick up in chapter 18, any thoughts of what we looked at so far here? It feels familiar, doesn't it? Chapter 18 is really pretty similar all the way through chapter 19. And so what I want to focus on in chapter 18 is this. In chapter 18 and verse 3, Joshua said to the children of Israel, to the 7 tribes that don't yet, that's what verse 2 says. In verse 2 it says, there remained among the children of Israel 7 tribes which have not yet received their inheritance. And so Joshua said to these 7 tribes, how long will you neglect to go and possess the land which the Lord your God, the God of your fathers, has given you? And then he gives them instructions to go, to survey the land, and then to take people and to conquer whatever has not been conquered, and to possess what God has blessed them with. And I think it describes that then. It begins in verse 11 with Benjamin, and that's what they did. Chapter 19 has the other 6 tribes from Simeon to Dan, and that's what they did as well, to an extent. Now, none of them did it all the way like Caleb did, but they did it to an extent. But the point, I think, here is most people will neglect the inheritance that God has given them without leadership and encouragement. Most people will neglect the inheritance that God has given them without leadership to guide them and to push them. The encouragement, Joshua says, will you neglect this duty and inheritance that God has given you? How long, he says, will you neglect to go and to do what God has given you? And that's, I think, we see how important it is that we have good leaders, and that we think about the future and are building within the generations that are coming up good leaders, because without good leaders, God's people never accomplish all that they really should and would accomplish. And that's what Joshua was for them. And so it's so important that we're grateful for good leaders and that we're always working to build that new generation of good leaders, lest the church go astray otherwise. All right. That is, you can tell I'm kind of flying through this tonight, but there is time for comments and stuff if we have them. That is through chapter 19, the dividing of the land. We're also going to look at chapters 20 and 21 briefly, but before we move on to that, any other comments or thoughts on the dividing of the land? Okay.
Was any of this preset on which tribe would get what, or did they just, I don't know how they...
They cast lots.
Okay,
And it describes that, let's see here. It's in chapter 18 where it says, verse 10, chapter 18 and verse 10, after they surveyed the land, they wrote down the borders in a book. In verse 10, it says Joshua cast lots for them in Shiloh before the Lord, and there Joshua divided the land to the children of Israel according to their divisions. In essence, what happened was 3 of them asked for this side. Because they just asked, Moses said yes, and so they kind of decided that on their own. Judah, in essence, got picked first because it is the leading tribe, and so they chose their portion. And then Ephraim and Manasseh, coming from Joseph, because they are the firstborn, because of the blessing of Jacob, they picked theirs. The rest of them cast lots for it. And so when they cast the lots, it says in verse 11, now the lot of the tribe of the children of Benjamin came up according to their families. And the idea is they came up first. In chapter 19 and verse 1, it says the second lot came out for Simeon. And so when they drew the lot, Benjamin was first. So they said, Benjamin, you go pick your spot. And then the second lot came out for Simeon, and okay, you go pick your spot. They picked their spot from the middle of Judah's, right in the center of Judah's territory, because it says they had too much space, and so they were able to get some of it in the middle of that, and so forth and so on. And so these 7 tribes, just in order, Dan just came out last, and so he picked his spot last, and he never actually took over it. That section of the map where the Philistines lived, where Goliath was from, and where David had so much trouble from through his whole life, was supposed to belong to Dan. They never conquered an ounce of it. Instead, they went far north and conquered somebody else's land and called that Dan instead. And so they pretty much didn't do any of what they were supposed to do. And that perhaps is why they came up last in the lot. I don't know. So yeah, they cast those lots kind of in that order to decide who would get what land. And then, of course, Caleb, because he was one of those 2 spies, got to pick his. And in chapter 19 and verse 49, it says, when they had made an end of dividing the land as an inheritance according to their borders, the children of Israel gave an inheritance among them to Joshua the son of Nun. So everyone knows where they belong now, and they said, Joshua gets to just pick from among any of it where he wants to live, which is a fitting honor, you think, for the man who had led them through all of this. And so, verse 20, according to the word of the Lord, they gave him the city which he asked for, Timnath-Serah, in the mountains of Ephraim. And so he built his city there, and he dwelt in it. And when you get to chapter 23 and verse 1, it says, it came to pass a long time after the Lord had given rest to Israel from all their enemies, round about that Joshua was old, advanced in age. And so God called him old, but he actually lived a lot longer than that. So he got the inheritance, but he got to enjoy it for a very long time. And so, and then verse 51, these were the inheritances which all of these people kind of helped them to organize and to give to the people. Now, that's about devotion, being wholly devoted to God and getting all the blessings he offers, versus giving God a part of yourself and getting a part of what God offers in this life. Chapters 20 and 21 are about how this path to victory that God has given us is full of grace. That even in the Old Testament, God talks a lot about his grace. Chapter 20 is about the most grievous sin that a person could do on accident. The biggest and worst sin that could be described that a person could accidentally do. What if you accidentally kill someone? And the idea there is that they set up these 6 cities of refuge. They're actually Levite cities where the priests and the Levites lived. And if you were here in South Judah and you were out chopping down trees in the forest and you accidentally chopped one down and it fell and it crushed somebody and they died, then his brother or his father or somebody had the right to chase you down and make that right, an eye for an eye, a life for a life. He had the right to do that. That was how justice was sort of organized. But if it was an accident, you could run to the city of refuge, and upon reaching the city gate, you could say, I accidentally killed someone, please let me in. And there was a safe place where the avenger of blood could not come in and could not perform that duty until a trial was held and until the elders of the town could determine, is he telling the truth, or did he kill him on purpose and he's lying about it now? And if the trial proved that you were innocent, then in verse 6 it says you could go back to your own city, and the avenger of blood is not allowed to they recognize it was an accident. But you see what's going on here is, just one moment, you see what's going on here is, this is the worst possible thing that you could do against another human, according to the law of Moses. Take a life, and God still has grace for it. There's still room to stumble. And so if that's true of the worst one, isn't it true of all of the, lesser things that a person could do? That while we should follow God with all of our hearts, a total devotion, God never requires perfection. He knows that we're going to stumble, and he has found a way to protect us and to give us refuge even when we do. Jimmy?
This is such a great point, I think, in application for our country today. The sanctuary cities were there because it was eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth.
Sure.
You go there to make sure that they were treated fairly.
Yes.
And so many people in this country want to distort that.
Sure.
And say, well, here it is, we should have sanctuary cities, and they don't have an inkling of what a sanctuary city was there for.
It's not a free-for-all kind of
Try to
thing.
misuse it through an issue in our government today.
Yeah, it's certainly not the same government, yeah. And so, this is, and really it's a very beautiful picture of what Christ does for us, that when we sin, his blood continues to cover us, as 1 John describes, and we continue to be in the light, even though we have stumbled. And then in chapter 21, he shows us the city of the Levites. And remember, the Levites had no land of their own, as was mentioned earlier. They were the only tribe that didn't have their own land, because they had a special honor of serving God as the priest. But they just physically do need houses. They're not expected to just live out in the woods or something. And so each tribe then in chapter 21 says, we will give these cities to the Levites, that it's theirs. We're going to make that sacrifice and give it to them. And although it is in our land, we will let them live there. And 6 of those were the cities of refuge, but there were others besides. But the one that really gets me is found in verse 11. Notice in verse 11, it's describing the cities that this tribe of Judah gave. And in verse 11 it says, and they gave them Kirjath Arba. Arba was the father of Anak, which is Hebron. Now, which mountain is Hebron? I can't either sometimes. It's the one that Caleb conquered. This guy, 85 years old, goes up on a mountain and conquers it because this is his city. And then he says, and the Levites can have it. He's going to guess live with his daughter next door where they have the upper springs and lower springs. I don't know. But, he has overflowing devotion to obey and follow God. And then he just gives it all up and gives it to somebody else. He has so much that he doesn't even mind giving up what he himself conquered through God's grace and power. And verse 12, but the fields of the city and its villages they gave to Caleb the son of Jephunneh as his possession. And so he lived around there, but he didn't even live in that city that he conquered himself. That is, beyond overflowing devotion and generosity to give back to God and to the people who are working on God's behalf. And it's just kind of it strikes me how faithful a person Caleb was. And so he kind of wraps it all up in verse 43. And he says, so the Lord gave to Israel all the land of which he had sworn to give them to their fathers, and they took possession of it, and they dwelt in it. The Lord gave them rest all around, according to all that he had sworn to their fathers, and not a man of all their enemies stood against them. The Lord delivered all their enemies into their hand, and not a word failed of any good thing which the Lord has spoken to the house of Israel. All came to pass. Now, here I think is the point of all of this. Was God able to fulfill his promise completely? Absolutely. Completely overflowing faithfulness. Did Joshua conquer every king that God asked him to? He did. Joshua conquered every king. He completely conquered all that God told him to. Did the people actually drive out all the people? Did the Israelites drive out all the others? And so, I think when it comes down to it, when I receive a partial inheritance in this life of what God has promised me, that has to be on me. God has done everything to pave the path and extend the invitation to all of God's blessings, Jesus did everything God asked him to in this life and is still doing all that God asked him to in heaven in order to offer us all the blessings, just like Joshua did for God. The only reason why they didn't have all those blessings is because they didn't follow God completely to drive out all of the people. And it really, to me, for me, it becomes very personal to think about how the things that I lack, the blessings that I lack in this life, I can look at areas of my life and say, this is why. These are the things I'm struggling to let go of. This is the stuff that I'm having trouble giving over to God. This is what I'm holding on to, and so forth and so on. And this is why I do not have all that God has promised me in this life. Because God isn't holding anything back. Jesus isn't holding anything back. Remember 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 11? In 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 11, there's this sort of poem that Paul records. This is a faithful saying. This is always true, he says. 2 Timothy 2:11. If we died with him, we will live with him. That's true. Can't deny it. If we endure, we will reign with him. That's true. If we deny him, he will deny us. That's equally true. Verse 13, though. If we are faithless, he remains faithful. He cannot deny himself. God has done everything to give us every blessing he wants us to have. And that's equally true of Jesus. He is always faithful to the fullest extent of his nature. So the only reason why I'm missing out on what he's offering me is because I won't just give the rest to him. Perhaps that's true of you too. I think that Johnny's going to come up in a minute and to offer an invitation and to give us some announcements. Any last thoughts or comments on this section of Joshua? All right. Thank you all for your attention tonight.